The card lay on the salver at an angle that suggested the footman had set it down and immediately regretted it. There was a clause in a settlement that no one had thought it necessary to mention to her. There was a duke who might have called at her door with an honest offer and who had chosen, for reasons that make sense, only at 3 in the morning to do nothing of the sort. And there was a woman who, at that very moment, was folding a length of muslin with the quiet efficiency of a person who had closed an account and was prepared to depart. The rain of March fell upon the paving stones of Grosvenor Square with the dutiful patience of a rain that had decided long ago to be neither sudden nor kind, and the drawing-room smelled of hyacinth and beeswax. Winifred Aylmer was 25, plain in the way clever women are called plain when they refuse to look surprised by anything, and the gown she wore that morning was the colour of stone that had spent the whole winter under snow. A small greyhound with a copper collar lay across her slipper as though the slipper were the last warm place in England. On the low table by the window, beside a bowl of hothouse hyacinths and a stopped clock her father had never troubled to repair, the salver waited with its single card. The card bore no engraved name, only a line of a woman's hand, blotted once and then apparently forgiven. I have signed nothing. Tell me in the comments from what part of the world you are listening to this story. The city, the hour. I read everyone. And if these stories of dukes and ladies make your heart breathe more slowly, leave your subscription here. It is my quiet way of knowing you have come back. This is a work of fiction set in Regency, England. Characters, names, and situations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to persons or events real is mere coincidence. Aunt Persephone sat upon the settee with the particular immobility of a woman who was not going to be the first to speak in the room, though it had been her house for 11 years, and she had, in truth, opened her mouth twice already. She had a piece of embroidery in her lap that she never worked upon, and a cup of chocolate at her elbow that she never drank. And she was, as Winifred had long ago concluded, the tenderest jailer in the whole of Mayfair. On the settee opposite, 3 envelopes lay in the order Winifred had opened them. The first was from the family solicitor at Lincoln's Inn, dated on the previous Tuesday, addressed with correct formality to Miss W. Aylmer of Grosvenor Square. The second was from her cousin Julian at Aylmer Hall, dated 2 days before, complaining in the sideways manner Julian preferred to any other about the pheasants and the roof and the hall porter's manners. The third was the letter that ought never to have crossed her threshold. It had been directed to His Grace, the Duke of Halstead at Berkeley Square, and by some benign confusion of a boy of 14 who had never before carried a letter east of Bond Street. It had come instead to number 11 Grosvenor Square, to a young woman in stone-coloured muslin, who had offered him a cup of chocolate and a smile that promised nothing, and who had read, in the boy's presence, exactly enough of the letter to understand what she was reading, and then had folded it back into its envelope with the delicacy of a woman closing a fan. The letter had spoken of a clause. The clause was 70 words long. Her late uncle, 3 summers dead, had inserted it into the settlement at some indecent hour of the morning. She pictured him in the study at Aylmer Hall, at a walnut desk that had once belonged to his father, with a candle guttering and a decanter half empty, choosing for reasons that would only make sense at 3 in the morning, to trust the Duke of Halstead with the tenancy of Aylmer Hall upon the sole condition that Miss Winifred Aylmer should reside there unmarried until her 30th year. Nobody had thought to mention this to Miss Winifred Aylmer. The Duke had known since Tuesday. "You are not obliged," Aunt Persephone said from the settee, meaning the exact opposite. "I am not," Winifred agreed, meaning it. She smoothed the muslin. It lay flat with the quiet efficiency of a thing already decided upon. Somewhere in Mayfair, a man of 36 was being told by his valet that the pale green waistcoat did not suit him, and being wrong about it. She would call at 4. She would wear the pale butter gloves. She would not sit down until asked, And she would ask, before she was offered tea, whether His Grace had considered that a clause read in silence was still a clause, and that Aylmer Hall had, since her uncle's death, ceased to belong to any silence but her own. The card on the salver had said in her own hand, "I have signed nothing." She had written it herself that morning, before the muslin, before the cup of chocolate, before the boy. She had written it because the writing was the only part of the whole business over which she had complete command. She had not, in fact, signed anything, yet. For 7 years, no gentlewoman in London had spoken first to the Duke of Halstead, not since the business of his younger brother, whose name Winifred had heard perhaps 3 times in her life, and each time in a room that had gone quiet. Not since the business of his silence, which was not a silence precisely, but the sort of speech that consisted almost entirely of 2-word sentences and 1 deferred bow. He had come back to town in the winter of the previous year, 10 pounds thinner and 1 shade quieter, and the hostesses of London had adjusted their guest lists with the same weary efficiency with which they adjusted the seating for a widowed cousin, that is to say, quickly, and without asking anyone whether the arrangement suited them. He had gone to Lady Malcolm's rout because Lady Malcolm was his godmother and would have written him a letter about it if he had not. And he had stood beside a marble pillar and endured 111 glances that pretended not to be glances, and not one gentlewoman in the whole of the ballroom had greeted him first. Winifred, at 10 minutes past 10 in the evening, had walked across a Turkey carpet in gloves the colour of pale butter and had said good evening. The words had not been remarkable. They had not been meant to be. Everyone had watched. Nobody had breathed. He had bowed with a fraction of a second's delay that was not in fact hesitation, and had said good evening back. He had not, however, mentioned the clause. He had known, then, which meant that he had chosen in the space between her greeting and his bow not to mention it, which meant, further, that whatever the Duke of Halstead had been calculating behind the very unhelpful surface of his face was a calculation about her, and had been in progress for some days before she had knowingly entered the room. Aunt Persephone rose from the settee. She was a woman of a certain narrow width and of great undisplayed patience, and she moved through her drawing-room as though every piece of furniture in it were a relative she was trying not to offend. "He has known since Tuesday," Aunt Persephone said, "and he did not send a note." "He did not send a note," Winifred agreed. "He danced with Lady Serena Price twice on Thursday." "He did? Winifred, my love." "I know." They did not embroider the observation, either of them, because both understood it. Lady Serena Price was 26, of good family, of unspoiled complexion, and of the sort of income that made settlements a formality rather than a negotiation. She had a laugh that was designed for ballrooms, and a way of touching a fan against her collarbone that had made 2 curates and a viscount forget the second verse of a hymn. If the Duke of Halstead had danced with Lady Serena Price twice on Thursday, it was because Lady Serena Price had wished him to, and he had not wished to be uncivil about a woman whose father owned the north pasture that adjoined his own. This was not, in itself, a matter for the newspapers. It was, however, a matter for a small silence between Aunt Persephone and her niece across the low table with the salver and the card. The greyhound at Winifred's feet lifted its head as though offended on her behalf, and then settled again with the resignation of a creature who had understood, very early in life, that Miss Aylmer's feelings did not require the intervention of a dog. She smoothed the muslin one last time. She did not, in fact, wish to fold muslin. She wished to walk across Grosvenor Square in the rain and knock at the door of a house on Berkeley Square with a knuckle that would not tremble. But 4 o'clock was 4 o'clock, and the difference between a woman one respected and a woman one merely watched was very often the willingness to wait until the appointed hour. She stood, and Aunt Persephone stood also, and the greyhound stood, and the whole quiet company of them went to fetch a bonnet. It was one of those cold, indecisive London afternoons that begins grey without conviction and ends grey with determination. She walked because she wished the walking, and Aunt Persephone rode in the carriage behind her, because Aunt Persephone had known since Winifred was 15 when to insist and when to follow at a respectful distance. Berkeley Square was 6 minutes from Grosvenor Square, and Winifred Aylmer took 8 minutes to arrive because she stopped once at a bookseller's window to look at a copy of Cowper she had already read, and once at the corner of Charles Street to consider the possibility that she might in fact be about to make the most ill-considered call of her entire life. The door of the Duke of Halstead's house was of black-painted oak with a knocker in the shape of a lion's head, and the lion's mouth, she noticed, had recently been polished. She knocked. A butler of the particular grey dignity that dukes seem to procure from a single, unadvertised warehouse in the north of England opened the door and looked at her with the expression of a man who had only that morning been given a list of names and instructions concerning them, and who had just discovered that her name was upon the list in the column headed at any hour. "Miss Aylmer," the butler said, which was not in fact a question. "Miss Aylmer," Winifred agreed. "His Grace is expecting me." "He is," the butler said, with the expression of a man who had been expecting her also, and who had been advised some hours previously that his opinion of the matter was neither required nor wished for. He led her, without further formality, up a staircase of pale stone that curved once against the wall of a lantern-lit hall, past a portrait of a woman with a small dog in her lap, who might have been the Duke's grandmother, past a door standing half open onto a room whose walls were the colour of a good ripe pear, and along a corridor whose only ornament was a series of watercolours of the sea. The house was warmer than her own, and quieter, and it smelled of wood smoke and beeswax and faintly of paper. On the threshold of a room at the end of the corridor, the butler stopped and bowed and announced her and stepped aside. The library at Berkeley Square was 2 lofts of books and 1 fire, and the Duke of Halstead was seated at a desk of dark mahogany with his back to a window that gave onto the small formal garden. He was writing. He continued to write for the space of 2 heartbeats after the butler's announcement, which is not, in fact, a discourtesy, because a gentleman with a pen in his hand is finishing a sentence, not composing an insult. Then he set the pen down, capped the inkwell with the little brass lid, blotted the page with a slow, careful hand, and rose. He was tall in the way that made ceilings appear low, and he stood with the expression of a man who had already calculated every possible question she might ask, and had prepared answers to none of them. "Miss Aylmer," he said. "Your Grace," she said. The word "Your Grace" was still, at that moment, a formality in her voice. It had not yet acquired the second syllable of anger that Aunt Persephone would learn to hear later in the week. "You will not sit," he said. "I will not, until asked." "Then I ask." She sat. The chair was of green leather and the seat was a little worn on the left side, and she wondered briefly how many gentlemen had, over the years, sat on that chair and shifted their weight when the conversation grew inconvenient. The Duke of Halstead did not sit. He walked once to the fireplace, adjusted a coal with the toe of his boot, and turned back with his hands behind him, in the attitude of a man who was very deliberately not offering her tea. "I imagine you have questions," he said. "I have one question." He inclined his head. "How long?" she said. "Did you intend to allow me to reside at Aylmer Hall in the belief that I did so of my own uncomplicated choosing?" He was quiet for a moment. There was a coal in the grate that shifted and fell, and the small collapse it made was, for the duration of one breath, the only sound in the library. 3 years, he said, before I told you, perhaps 4. It depended on the temper of your cousin Julian. You calculated in years. I did. And you did not, at any point during those calculations, consider that the plainest civility would be to write me a letter. I considered it, Miss Aylmer, at some length, and decided against it, and decided that a letter would give you nothing that you did not already possess, and would deprive you of the one thing I could give you without patronage, which is the belief that the choice to remain at Aylmer Hall was your own. She looked at him. It is a very particular look, the look of a woman who has just been told the truth by a man who has not previously distinguished himself as a giver of truths. And it consists of a very small tightening of the mouth and a very small softening of the eyes. And it means neither approval nor forgiveness, but only that the woman has heard, and is now in possession of a fact she did not previously possess, and is calculating what to do with it. "Your Grace," she said, "the boy who brought your solicitor's letter to my door this morning is 14 years old, and is fond of chocolate, and will, in the fullness of time, make some very good woman a very anxious husband. Please do not dismiss him. It was I who invited him inside." The Duke of Halstead did something with his mouth that was, perhaps, the beginning of a movement toward a smile, and did not complete it. "I had not intended to dismiss him," he said. "I had intended to raise his wages by 2 shillings on the quarter, and to warn him against future generosity with private correspondence." "That is a kinder response than I would have predicted." "I am kinder than my reputation, Miss Aylmer, and less kind than my mother imagines." "Your mother," she said, "is at present in Bath, if the papers are to be believed." "My mother," he said, "is at present in Bath, and will be in London by Thursday next, and will have a great deal to say to me before she has any tea. I do not, however, intend that she should have anything to say to you at all." She was quiet. The greyhound was not, of course, with her. Aunt Persephone was walking it, no doubt, in a small, dignified circle around the square. But she wished briefly for the dog's warmth on her slipper. "You did not mention the clause on Tuesday evening," she said, "at Lady Malcolm's rout." "I did not." "You danced twice with Lady Serena Price on Thursday." "I did." "You are, at present, giving me no reason whatever to believe you had any intention of ever mentioning it." The Duke of Halstead crossed the library. He did not sit still, but he came to the chair opposite hers, and put one hand on the back of it, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had, perhaps, prepared a speech, and had, in the last 3 seconds, decided against delivering it. "Miss Aylmer," he said, "in 7 years you are the only gentlewoman of my acquaintance who has spoken to me first. I did not deserve it on Tuesday. I have not deserved it since. But it occurred to me, in the interval between your greeting and my bow, that I had been offered a very small piece of a very ordinary courtesy, and that I would rather not spoil it by burdening you at once with a legal instrument that concerns you far more nearly than it concerns me." He paused. "I intended to write," he said, "in April. April is next week. April is next week." "Then," Winifred said, "we shall consider your intention fulfilled 10 days earlier than you had planned, and I shall not require the letter." She rose. He remained standing, of course, because he had never in fact sat down. "I will go to Aylmer Hall," she said, "on the 9th of April. I will reside there until I turn 30. I will not marry. I will not depart. I will keep the estate accounts myself, since my cousin Julian has demonstrated in the last 3 years an admirable talent for confusing the pheasant tenancy with the pheasants themselves. And I will not, Your Grace, spend the 4 remaining years of my majority in the belief that a man who danced twice with Lady Serena Price on Thursday is the guardian of my dignity. Are we agreed?" "We are agreed." "Good day, Your Grace." "Good day, Miss Aylmer." She walked down the corridor with the sea watercolours upon the wall, and past the room whose walls were the colour of a good ripe pear, and past the portrait of the woman with the small dog upon her lap, and down the pale stone staircase, and out of the door with the newly polished lion, and into a rain that had not, after all, stopped. Aunt Persephone was in the carriage on the far side of Berkeley Square, with the greyhound in her lap and an unopened prayer book in her hand, and Winifred climbed inside and closed the door and, for a very small moment, permitted herself to lean her forehead against the window. "He said something," Aunt Persephone remarked without turning her head. "He said several things." "Anything that mattered?" He said he was kinder than his reputation. Aunt Persephone did nothing with her face for the space of 3 seconds, which was, for Aunt Persephone, the equivalent of a 5-minute soliloquy. "Well," she said, "that is not nothing. The rain of April, when it came, was more decisive than the rain of March had been. Aylmer Hall stood upon a low rise in the county of Hampshire, 4 miles from the market town of Barrow St. Mary and 11 miles from the sea, in a park of 200 acres that had been laid out in the middle of the previous century by a landscape gardener whose name was no longer written down, but whose taste for a serpentine drive was still legible in the earth. The house was of grey stone, with a portico of 4 Ionic columns of a scale that the architect had, on reflection, wished he had made slightly smaller, and it had a west front and a south front, and no east front to speak of, because the east side of the house was a walled garden that ran up against a kitchen court, and the whole assembly had the air of a house that had grown, over 140 years, into precisely the arrangement its occupants preferred. Winifred took possession of Aylmer Hall on the 9th of April. She took possession, that is to say, in the perfect legal sense. She was the residuary legatee, and the settlement had been read, and the tenancy was held on her behalf by His Grace the Duke of Halstead as trustee under her late uncle's will, but she took possession also in the small practical sense that mattered to her most, which is to say that she walked into the housekeeper's room on the morning of the 10th and asked Mrs. Emberley, the housekeeper, whether the household books were in the housekeeper's desk or in the steward's office. Mrs. Emberley, who was of the same particular grey dignity as the Duke's butler, and who had known Winifred since Winifred was 3 years old, did something with her mouth that was the contented equivalent of a private smile, and produced the books from a drawer in her own desk. "I hoped, miss, that you would ask," she said. "I hoped, Mrs. Emberley, that you would have them. His Grace's man from London wrote in March to ask whether they were in good order." "And you replied?" "I replied that they were in perfect order, miss, but that Miss Aylmer would wish to see them for herself." Winifred looked at Mrs. Emberley. Mrs. Emberley looked at the books. The books, which were bound in a russet leather that had, in the course of 7 years, been rubbed pale at the spines, said nothing at all. "He is a fair man, miss," Mrs. Emberley said after a moment, in the tone of a woman who was not committing herself to anything more than the fairness. "He came in November of last year to look at the north drains, and he did not require luncheon. He came in November, for 1 afternoon, miss. He did not stay the night. He did not, in fact, cross the threshold of the house. He walked in the wet as far as the north drain and back, and he sent word that he would pay for the repairs upon his own account, since the drains were his tenant's business and not the estate's. Mr. Ashe, the steward, has the receipts." Winifred did not, at that moment, know what to do with the information that His Grace the Duke of Halstead had, in November of the previous year, walked in the wet as far as her north drain and back, and had not required luncheon. It was the sort of piece of information one puts into a drawer for later, and closes the drawer, and does not open again until the 3rd or 4th time one has occasion to. She set the household books on the desk in the small parlour that had been her mother's. The parlour looked out upon the walled kitchen garden and had a bow window with 3 small panes of glass that had been made in a bad year and were, in consequence, faintly green. She opened the first book and began to read. For the next 6 weeks, Winifred Aylmer read household books. She rode out with Mr. Ashe, the steward, on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and looked at fences and at the state of the drainage of the north pasture, and at the roof of the tenant farmer's cottage at Broken Barrow. She rode home in the afternoons, with a light in her face that Aunt Persephone had not seen since Winifred was 18, which was the light of a woman whose brain was at last being given something to do. She wrote letters to her cousin Julian in London, in which she was polite about the pheasants and firm about the accounts. She wrote letters to the Duke of Halstead's solicitor in Lincoln's Inn, in which she was polite about the accounts and firm about the fact that no repair was to be paid upon his Grace's account without her own counter-signature. She did not, in the whole of the 6 weeks, write a letter to the Duke of Halstead. He wrote to her twice. His hand was small and orderly, and his letters were 3 sentences long each, and they said, in the first instance, that the roof of the cottage at Broken Barrow was, in his recollection of a visit made in October 3 years previously, of thatch and not of slate, and that if slate were now to be considered, he would defer to her judgment and to the tenant's preference, and would meet the cost of the difference upon his own account, since the change of covering would raise the rateable value of the cottage, and would in that respect improve the estate. In the second instance, his letter said that Lady Serena Price had inquired at a small dinner in Grosvenor Square on the Thursday before last whether Miss Aylmer meant to attend the Havelock Ball in June, and that he had been unable to answer for her, and that he would be obliged for a note in his own private post if she wished the answer to be conveyed. He signed both letters, Halstead without ornament. She replied to both letters. To the first, she wrote that she would prefer thatch, since the tenant at Broken Barrow was a widow of 64, and the roofers who worked in thatch in the Hampshire villages were 3 men she trusted, and that she would meet the cost of the ordinary repair upon the estate account, and would be grateful if his Grace would meet the cost of the ridge upon his own, as had been his original intention. To the second, she wrote that she would attend the Havelock Ball in June, if Aunt Persephone were well enough to travel, and that his Grace was free to convey the answer to Lady Serena Price in any words he preferred, since Miss Aylmer had no particular acquaintance with Lady Serena Price, and could not be supposed to have any opinion about her attendance. She signed both letters W. Aylmer without ornament, and she made a small point of using her second-best paper, since the best was for family and for the family solicitor. There was, in the second letter, a sentence that she had considered writing and had not. The sentence had been, "It would please me to see you there, if the season permits." She had considered it at 7 in the evening upon a Monday, with a candle by her elbow and the greyhound at her slipper, and she had considered it again at 7 in the evening upon the Wednesday, and by the Thursday she had decided that the sentence was true, and that its truth was precisely the reason for which it should not be sent. He had already known that she was going to write him a letter about the ball. If he wished to be there when she was, he would arrange it. She had asked no favours of him at Berkeley Square in April that she was not prepared to ask of the London seasons for the 4 remaining years of her majority. She would keep her side of the bargain, he would keep his. They would meet, if they met, in the ordinary channels of the ordinary world, and if that world proved insufficient to the small, silent question she had begun, without permission, to carry in her chest, then she would keep the question silently, and it would trouble no one but herself. In the last week of May, the following things happened, in an order that seemed at the time coincidental, and later did not. Mrs. Emberley found, in a locked drawer of the old escritoire in the housekeeper's room, a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon that were, upon inspection, correspondence between Winifred's late uncle and a firm of solicitors in Bath. The letters were dated between the June and the December of the year of the uncle's death, and they concerned the settlement, and they were, when Winifred sat down to read them by the light of the bow window with the faintly green glass, a small and complete education in the way in which a dying man can decide, in the last 6 months of his life, to correct a wrong that no living person had been permitted to know was a wrong at all. Her uncle, it turned out, had been in debt. The debt had been contracted in the manner in which Hampshire baronets contract debts over a course of years and against the security of a house that could not, in strict law, secure them. The debt had grown to a sum that, if the creditors had chosen to press, would have obliged the sale of Aylmer Hall itself, and would have left Winifred at the age of 22 With the residue of a personal fortune of about £1,100 and the necessity of the very good marriage her uncle had spent 7 years arranging in his head, and had, out of a decency she had never before believed him to possess, declined to press upon her in fact. The debt had been discharged in the June of the year of her uncle's death. It had been discharged in a single payment. The letters did not name the person who had made the payment. They named only at one point, in the third of the 7 letters, in the closing paragraph of a page of otherwise routine legal instructions, the phrase "our mutual acquaintance in Berkeley Square." Winifred read the letter 3 times. She looked out of the bow window at the walled kitchen garden, where the pear tree that had been planted in the year of her birth was in the last of its blossom, and she thought about a man who had walked in the wet as far as her north drain and back in November and had not required luncheon. The card on the salver in Grosvenor Square in March had said, "I have signed nothing." Perhaps, she thought, she had signed a great deal more than she had known. The second thing that happened in the last week of May was that Lady Serena Price came to Aylmer Hall. She came unannounced, in a carriage of pale green with silver fittings, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon of a Wednesday, with a maid and a footman and a small dog of no particular breed, and with the announced intention of taking a cup of tea and inquiring after Miss Aylmer's health. She had been, she explained, staying at the Havelocks place at Stanbury St. Cross, which was 14 miles distant across the county, and she had heard that the Aylmer Hall pear blossom was very fine, and she had wished to see it. Winifred received her in the drawing-room of the west front, which was the room in which her mother had received the vicar for 31 years, and which had, in consequence, a smell of dried lavender and beeswax, and the faint smell of a coal fire that had been lit 2 hours before the visit, and permitted deliberately to burn low. "Miss Aylmer," Lady Serena Price said, with the smile that was designed for ballrooms. "Lady Serena," Winifred said, with the small, exact greeting that was designed for a woman one had never wished to know. They sat opposite one another across a low table upon which a tea service of white and gold had been arranged with the housekeeper's most respectful precision, and they spoke of the pear blossom for 4 minutes, and of the state of the roads for 3, and then Lady Serena Price, who had come in fact for one reason and one alone, set down her teacup and looked at Winifred over the rim of it with the expression of a woman who was, in her own estimation, doing Winifred a kindness. "His Grace of Halstead," she said, "will be at the Havelock Ball on the 21st of June. So I understand. He has told me in confidence that he does not intend to remain in London beyond the 23rd. So I understand also. His Grace has other duties in the country. He has, in fact, one very particular duty in the country." Winifred was quiet for a moment. She looked at Lady Serena Price across the tea service, and she considered a great many replies, and she selected the one that was, upon reflection, the most useful and the least sharp. "Lady Serena," she said, "if you have come to Aylmer Hall to tell me that His Grace intends to marry, you have taken a great deal of trouble for a piece of news that, when it is made public, will be public. If you have come to tell me that His Grace intends to marry you, in particular, you have taken more trouble still, because it is the sort of announcement that a woman should make of herself, and not through a neighbour's tea. And if you have come to inform me that His Grace's country duty at present relates in any legal way to the tenancy under which I hold this house, then I must beg you, in the very kindest terms available to me, to remember that I keep the household books of this estate in my own hand, and I have not seen your name upon them." Lady Serena Price did something with her mouth that was perhaps a smile, and did not in fact complete it. "You are very direct, Miss Aylmer." "I am not, in general," Winifred said, "but I have very little afternoon left and a great deal of accounting to do before the light goes." She rose. Lady Serena Price rose also. The tea service was left with 2 cups half full, and the pear blossom, which was, in truth, no better and no worse than the pear blossom in any Hampshire garden that spring, was not, in the end, admired at any length by the visitor. The pale green carriage, with the silver fittings, departed from Aylmer Hall at 20 minutes to 4, and Winifred stood at the bow window of the small parlour and watched it out of sight. And Mrs. Emberley came and stood beside her without saying anything, and the greyhound put its nose against Winifred's slipper, as though the slipper were a piece of information the dog had missed and now wished to gather. "Do you know, Mrs. Emberley," Winifred said, "I have for the first time in a fortnight remembered the colour of the gloves I wore at Lady Malcolm's rout. Pale butter, miss. Pale butter, Mrs. Emberley. They wore very well, miss. They wore very well, Mrs. Emberley. I shall pack them in the trunk on Monday." The third thing that happened in the last week of May was a letter from the Duke of Halstead. It was not one of the small 3-sentence letters. It was 4 pages on his private paper, without the crest, and it began without preamble, as though its writer had been walking around the sentences for some days and had at last, with a sigh, sat down to them. "Miss Aylmer," the letter began, "there is a matter of business between us which, upon reflection, my solicitors are not the correct instrument for. I mean the discharge of a certain debt of your late uncle's in the June of 1811. It was paid from my own account at Coates. It was paid without your knowledge at your uncle's request. It was, in my recollection at the time, a personal loan to your uncle upon the understanding that his estate would, in the fullness of a decent number of years, discharge it, and it has never appeared in any settlement or in any book of accounts of yours or of mine, because your uncle wished you to inherit a house free of any obligation you had not chosen. You do not owe me the sum, nor does your estate, nor does your family. I do not wish at any time in the future to be told that this debt is understood to have altered your circumstances or your obligations to me in any degree whatever. I write to inform you of the fact only because Mrs. Emberley wrote me last Wednesday to say that a bundle of correspondence had been found, and I would prefer that you should hear the story from me before you were obliged to guess at it. Yours, Halstead." Winifred read the letter twice. She read it a third time. She looked out of the bow window at the walled kitchen garden, in which the pear blossom, having been admired by no one who mattered, had begun to fall. And she thought about the difference between a man who dances twice with Lady Serena Price on a Thursday and a man who pays a debt of a stranger's uncle out of his own account at Coates and does not, in the intervening 3 years, mention it. She folded the letter into its envelope. She placed the envelope in the drawer of the escritoire in which she kept her private correspondence, and she locked the drawer, and she put the key on a ribbon around her neck, and she went to change for dinner. That night she wrote no reply. She wrote no reply on the following morning either, or on the morning after that. She wrote her reply, in the end, on the morning of the 1st of June, and it consisted of 2 sentences. "Your Grace," she wrote, "the debt was not mine, and I do not consider it altered. I shall see you, if it suits you, at the Havelock ball on the 21st. She signed it W. Aylmer. She did not use her best paper. She did not this time feel the need. The 21st of June came on a Thursday. Havelock Hall, which stood in the county of Wiltshire and had been in the possession of the Havelock family since the reign of Queen Elizabeth, was a house of a stone that turned honey in the setting sun, and had a ballroom of 112 feet in length, with 3 pairs of French windows opening onto a terrace, and a formal garden beyond the terrace, and a lawn beyond the garden, and a lake beyond the lawn. And the whole arrangement had been laid out by a landscape gardener, who had understood, better than most, that the guests at a ball wished to walk out into a view, and to walk back into a room, and to feel in both movements that they have crossed from one perfect place to another. On the evening of the 21st of June, Havelock Hall was lit by 932 candles, and by 2 chandeliers of Waterford crystal, and by the last of a summer's dusk that lay upon the terrace like a coat someone had forgotten to bring in. And it received into its ballroom, between 8 and 9:30, 341 persons of the sort that Wiltshire and Hampshire and the near half of Berkshire supplied to its own great houses in the 3rd season of the year. Winifred Aylmer arrived at 10 minutes past 8. She wore a gown of pale grey silk, with a narrow band of silver at the hem and at the sleeve, and gloves the colour of pale butter, and her mother's pearls, which were 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and had been set into a necklace that closed with a small gold clasp shaped like a peacock, and her hair was arranged in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, with 2 very small pearls set into the twist. Aunt Persephone was at her elbow, in a gown of a deeper grey, and with an expression that made it entirely clear that any woman in the ballroom who wished to be uncivil to her niece would have to be uncivil to her first. The greyhound, of course, was at Aylmer Hall in the housekeeper's parlour with a bowl of chicken and Mrs. Emberley's approval. The Duke of Halstead was in the ballroom already. He was standing beside a marble pillar near the 3rd pair of French windows, in the attitude of a man who had been standing there for perhaps 20 minutes, and did not intend to stand there for many more. And he was speaking when Winifred entered to Lord Havelock himself, who was a stout, kind man of 56, with the expression of a man who had, at last, married off his eldest daughter, and now considered the rest of humanity a hobby rather than a duty. He saw her. It is a very small thing to say that a man in a ballroom sees a woman enter it, and yet the whole architecture of the evening turned upon it. He did not move. He did not, in fact, alter the small, easy conversation he was making with Lord Havelock. He did, however, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, cease to consider leaving the ballroom, which he had, in fact, been considering, and he set his shoulders in the very small way that a man sets his shoulders when he has decided to remain in a room for a purpose he had not, until that moment, entirely permitted himself to name. Aunt Persephone at Winifred's elbow made a small sound that was not, in the strict sense, a word, and Winifred did not turn her head, and the 2 of them advanced into the ballroom with the exact deliberation of 2 women who had, on the way from the antechamber, discussed nothing because nothing needed discussing. The Havelocks' ballroom was, that evening, a small society in miniature, and it worked upon its usual rules. Lady Serena Price was there, in a gown of a pale rose that was designed for candlelight and for the flattery of a complexion that did not need flattery, and she was, at the moment of Winifred's entrance, dancing a quadrille with a young officer of the Guards who had been assigned to her, one gathered, by her father, and who was accomplishing the assignment with the earnest patience of a young officer of the Guards. She saw Winifred also. She did nothing with her face. This was, in Lady Serena Price's private vocabulary, the equivalent of a very great deal, and Winifred, who by nature preferred not to notice these things, noticed. The first hour of the ball passed as such hours pass. Winifred danced twice with young men she had known since she was 15, and had never particularly wished to marry, and had, in that hour, no cause to reconsider. She spoke with Lady Havelock about the pear blossom, and with Lady Havelock's sister about a horse. She drank 1 cup of ratafia and left the second on the tray. She did not, in the whole of the first hour, speak to the Duke of Halstead, and he did not, in the whole of the first hour, speak to her, and yet the 2 of them moved through the ballroom as though on the invisible ends of a taut cord, and neither of them, at any point, permitted the cord to slacken, and neither of them permitted it to pull. At 10:30, the country dance was called. It was to be a Sir Roger de Coverley, which was a dance of half an hour in the running and a dance for 22 couples, and the whole of the ballroom that was not dancing came to the walls to watch, and the whole of the ballroom that was dancing lined up in the 2 long lines of gentlemen and ladies, and Winifred, at her place near the third pair of French windows, was partnered by Mr. Ashworth, who was Lord Havelock's second cousin and a curate of a good living in Berkshire, and who was, in the ordinary course of things, an excellent partner because he could dance and could speak of nothing in particular for half an hour without offence. He offered her his hand. She took it. They took their places, 2 lines below her in the arrangement, on the gentleman's side. The Duke of Halstead took his place opposite Lady Serena Price. It is one of the small cruelties of the country dance that a couple who begin at opposite ends of a line will, upon the second run through the figure, meet in the middle and be obliged to dance together for 8 bars before parting again to the other end. Winifred, who had been dancing country dances since she was 13, knew this. Lady Serena Price knew it. The Duke of Halstead, who had been dancing country dances for rather longer, knew it also. And so, by the 5th run through the figure, when the music brought her down the line, and Lady Serena Price up the line, and the Duke of Halstead from the far end of the gentleman's side, Winifred found herself in the middle of a Sir Roger de Coverley in a Wiltshire ballroom, with 932 candles burning around her, being turned once by a curate in a country living, being turned once by the Duke of Halstead, being turned once by a young officer of the Guards, being turned once again by the Duke of Halstead, and the whole of the ballroom, which had gathered to watch, watched. He said nothing on the first turn. The music was too loud, and his hand was very warm through the pale butter glove. He said on the second turn, in a voice pitched exactly for her ear and for no one else's, "The library at Havelock Hall is at the top of the south stair, 3 doors along." She said on the third turn, "I am not in the habit, Your Grace, of accepting invitations to libraries from gentlemen at balls." He said on the 4th turn, "Nor am I in the habit, Miss Aylmer, of extending them. I am asking you to grant me an exception." She said on the 5th turn, "I shall consider it." He said on the 6th turn, "I shall be there at 11:30. She said on the 7th turn, "You may be there at 11:30, Your Grace. I do not, however, promise to be." He said on the 8th turn, "I understand." And then the figure carried them apart, and the Duke of Halstead danced her partner, Lady Serena Price, to the far end of the line, and Winifred danced Mr. Ashworth of the Berkshire curacy to the near end. And the music went on, and it was as though the whole of the ballroom exhaled at the same moment, and no one, in the ordinary sense, breathed at all. At the end of the dance, Lady Serena Price laughed a very particular laugh that had until that evening been designed for the flattery of curates and viscounts, and turned to the Duke of Halstead with her fan against her collarbone. He bowed to her with the small, correct bow of a gentleman who has, in fact, discharged an obligation, and he did not smile. He walked her back to her chaperone, who was Lady Serena's aunt on her mother's side, and he made the small, correct compliment that a gentleman makes at the end of a country dance. And he did not offer to fetch her a glass of anything, and he walked back down the length of the ballroom with the expression of a man who had one appointment to keep and did not, at that particular moment, particularly care who saw him keep it. Aunt Persephone at Winifred's elbow said, "I think, my love, I shall sit down." "Aunt Persephone," Winifred said, "I think in the last minute I have made a decision." "I had not doubted it," Aunt Persephone said. "I only wondered when you would tell me." The library at Havelock Hall was at the top of the south stair, 3 doors along. Winifred went up the south stair at 25 minutes past 11 with the deliberate lightness of a woman who was carrying no candle and was quite certain she did not require one. The corridor at the top of the stair was lit by a single lamp on a bracket, and the door of the library was standing ajar by perhaps half an inch, in the way that a door stands ajar when someone inside has meant to close it and has decided, on reflection, to leave it as a small kindness to whoever might follow. She pushed the door open. The library at Havelock Hall was smaller than the library at Berkeley Square, and older, and it smelled of the good particular smell of a library that had been in continuous private use for 4 generations, which is a smell of old paper and older leather, and faintly of the tobacco a great-grandfather had been forbidden by his wife to smoke elsewhere. There was 1 candle upon a low table, and 1 glass of water beside the candle, and the Duke of Holstead was standing at the far end of the room in front of a small window that looked upon the moonlit lake, with his back to the door, in the attitude of a man who had heard her come in and was not going to turn around until he had said what he had come upstairs to say. "Miss Aylmer," he said without turning. "Your Grace." He turned. She had not, in fact, seen his face in adequate light for 6 weeks. In the ballroom, he had been at a distance, and in the country dance he had been in motion, and in the library at Berkeley Square in April he had been standing between her and the window, and she had seen him mostly against a bright March light. Here, by the 1 candle on the low table, his face was the face of a man who had done a great deal of thinking in the past 6 weeks, and had come, at last, to the small, quiet ledge from which one either steps or does not. He crossed the room. He stopped at a respectful distance of perhaps 4 feet. "I have not," he said, "come to speak to you of the debt. I did not suppose you had. I have not come to speak to you of Lady Serena Price. I did not suppose you had. I have not come to speak to you of the tenancy or the settlement or the cottage at Broken Barrow or the North Drain. I did not, Your Grace, suppose that of any of them. I have come to ask you a single question, which I have no right to ask, and which you have every right to refuse, and which I ask notwithstanding both." She was quiet. He did not proceed at once. He looked, for the space of 2 heartbeats, at the candle on the low table, as though the candle were a piece of information he was consulting, and then he looked back at her. "Miss Aylmer," he said, "on the 9th of April, when you took possession of Aylmer Hall, you told me that you did not intend to marry." "I told you that I did not intend to marry. Was that a description of the 4 years of the clause, or was it a description of a permanent condition?" She looked at him. It was a look that took a certain time to compose. It included, in its composition, the walk from Grosvenor Square to Berkeley Square in a March rain, and the 8 minutes she had taken to arrive because she had stopped to consider the possibility that she was about to make the most ill-considered call of her life, and the 6 weeks at Aylmer Hall, in which the colour of Mrs. Emberley's approving mouth had, 3 times a week, been the best small commendation of her days, and the pear blossom that had fallen without being admired by Lady Serena Price, and the letter about the debt, and the answer she had written on the 1st of June that had cost her 4 blank sheets of good paper. "It was a description of the 4 years of the clause, Your Grace," she said. He did not, for the space of 2 heartbeats, move. Then he did the smallest possible thing. He inclined his head 1 fraction of an inch. It was not, in any strict social sense, a bow. It was the small movement of the head that a man makes when he has been told a piece of information for which he had been prepared to wait a great deal longer, and had received it unexpectedly 4 years and 8 weeks in advance. "Thank you," he said. She waited. He did not at that moment propose. She had not, in fact, expected him to. She had understood, on the 2nd turn of the country dance, that he would not propose to her at 11:30 at the top of the south stair 3 doors along at Havelock Hall, because he was a man who paid debts out of his own account at Coutts without telling anyone about it, and men of that kind did not, as a rule, propose to a woman across a candle at midnight when there was any other decent way of proposing to her at all. "There is," he said, "a further matter which I ought to mention." "Please do." "My mother," he said, "is at present in London. She has been informed by 3 of her acquaintances that I danced twice with Lady Serena Price on the first Thursday of May, and once with Lady Serena Price this evening. She has not been informed that I asked you, in the middle of a country dance, whether you would join me in a library at 11:30. I imagine she has not. She will, however, be informed by tomorrow morning, since the ballroom has watched, and the ballroom is not, in the general run of things, careful with information of this kind. I imagine she will be. She will write to me by tomorrow evening. I imagine she will. She will, in that letter, in her particular way, express her hope that I have not, in the course of one Wiltshire evening, taken leave of the sense of duty upon which the whole of the Halstead family has, since the 15th century, prided itself. Your Grace, Winifred said, I have no interest whatever in what your mother writes to you by tomorrow evening. I have every interest in what you write to her by tomorrow morning. He looked at her. The candle on the low table burned very steadily. Somewhere in the ballroom, 3 floors below, the orchestra was tuning for the last set of the evening, and the small, distant sound of a violin, coming back to its A, rose through the boards of the floor like a memory rising through water. I shall write to her, he said, by tomorrow morning, Miss Aylmer, that I have found in the ballroom of Havelock Hall the reason for which I did not marry any of the ladies she had, in the last 4 years, brought most cordially to my attention. And I shall write to her that the reason has a name, and that the name is Miss Winifred Aylmer of Aylmer Hall in Hampshire, and that the reason has, moreover, done me the very great kindness of speaking to me first. Winifred was quiet. She was quiet for a very small time, because the small time was, in fact, all the time she needed. She had, at that moment, no particular arithmetic to do. She had understood, on the 9th of April, when she had opened the household books, that she was in possession of a life that suited her, and she had understood, in the last week of May, when she had read the letter about the debt, that she was in possession of a piece of information that altered her private weather without altering in any legal way her public balance sheet. She had understood on the 7th turn of the country dance that a man who was willing to be watched by the whole of a Wiltshire ballroom for the sake of 8 bars of music was a man who had for some months now been considering the question of her rather more seriously than she had permitted herself to consider his answer. She had come up the south stair at 11:25 for a reason. She had at last, at 11:30, arrived at it. Your Grace, she said, I shall not at this moment undertake to give you the answer to a question you have not at this moment asked. I shall, however, undertake to be at Aylmer Hall at 4 o'clock upon the afternoon of the 28th of June, and to receive a caller, should any caller present himself. Should such a caller present himself, and should such a caller have a question of a formal nature, I shall be prepared at that hour to give him the beginning of an answer. I understand. I do not undertake, Your Grace, to give him the whole of the answer at once. Miss Aylmer, I have not at any time in the past 3 months asked you for the whole of any answer at once. I know, Your Grace. I do not intend to begin at 11:30 upon the 21st of June. I know that also. He inclined his head again, 1 fraction of an inch. He did not step closer. He did not, in fact, do anything with his hand, or with his voice, or with his face, which would have altered the small, strict decency of a room in which a gentleman and a lady stood 4 feet apart across a candle. He did, however, say one further thing. Miss Aylmer, I have kept in the small drawer of the desk in my library at Berkeley Square since the 12th of March, a card. The card was left at my house on the morning of the 12th of March by a boy who had, in the ordinary course of his employment, mistaken a door on Grosvenor Square for a door on Berkeley Square. The card is in a hand I did not at the time recognize, and it reads, I have signed nothing. I confess I have looked at it on occasion at 3 in the morning and have wondered whether the sentence was written for my benefit or whether it was written entirely for the benefit of the woman who wrote it. "Your Grace," Winifred said, "it was written entirely for the benefit of the woman who wrote it. She is glad, however, that you have kept it. I shall continue to keep it. Please do." She turned. She walked to the door of the library at Havelock Hall. At the door, she paused with her hand upon the frame, and she said, without turning her head, "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Miss Aylmer." She went down the south stair. Aunt Persephone was in the antechamber at the foot of the south stair with her prayer book in her lap and the expression of a woman who was neither surprised nor unsurprised by anything, and Winifred took her arm, and the two of them went back into the ballroom for the last set of the evening, and Winifred danced with an elderly cousin of Lord Havelock's who had known her father, and Aunt Persephone sat on a small gilt chair at the edge of the room, and permitted herself for the first time in a fortnight a small private smile. The 28th of June came on a Thursday. Aylmer Hall had, in the 7 days between the ball and the caller, been given a small, quiet cleaning of the sort that houses receive when the housekeeper knows something she has not been told, and the roses on the terrace of the south front had been dead-headed by the head gardener on the Tuesday, and the walks of the walled kitchen garden had been raked on the Wednesday, and the greyhound had been washed on the Wednesday evening under the impression that the washing was for its own sake, and the small parlour of the bow window with the 3 faintly green panes had been arranged upon the little table between the 2 green leather chairs, with a bowl of hothouse strawberries and a pot of cream and a small blue and white teapot that had been in the family since the reign of King George II. He came at 4 o'clock. He came alone, on a bay horse that he handed to the groom at the door, with the small, easy word of a man who had, in the course of a long private education, learned to speak to horses in short sentences and to grooms in shorter ones. He was shown into the small parlour of the bow window by Mrs. Emberley in person, and Mrs. Emberley closed the door behind him with the particular precision of a woman who had been closing doors upon private conversations in the house for 32 years. Winifred rose. She did not offer her hand. She did not, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 28th of June, in her mother's parlour, at Aylmer Hall in Hampshire, need to. The Duke of Halstead crossed the room in 3 steps and stopped at the customary distance of a gentleman calling in the country, and he inclined his head in the very small bow of a caller who has taken off his gloves in the hall and has, in the course of the walk from the hall to the parlour, discovered that he has no idea what he intends to do with his hands. "Miss Aylmer," he said. "Your Grace." "Winifred," he said. It was the first time he had said the name. He said it as though the name were a piece of furniture he had been permitted to move, and had at last, with a small hesitation, moved. "Yes, Your Grace, I have," he said, "on the small table in my library at Berkeley Square, a folder of papers. It contains, among other things, a copy of the settlement and a copy of the correspondence with your uncle in the June of 1811, and a draft of a new instrument which, if you should upon consideration find it acceptable, would extinguish the 7th clause of the settlement of your uncle upon such terms as would leave you entirely at liberty, at any moment of any of the 4 years remaining to you before your 30th birthday, either to remain at Aylmer Hall in your own right, or to leave it, without in either case suffering the smallest diminution of your right in the estate, or of your right in yourself." He paused. He looked for a moment at the strawberries in the bowl. "I have not, in bringing this instrument," he said, "any intention of altering my own position with regard to the estate, which is that of a trustee under your uncle's will. I have not, in bringing it, any intention of altering my own position with regard to you, which is that of a man who has, since the 9th of April, come as slowly as he was able to the understanding that the small unspoken bargain by which you took possession of the household books of this estate has, without either of us naming it, become the small unspoken bargain of my own life. I bring the instrument, Winifred, because I do not wish at any future hour that a decision you make about me should be a decision that a clause has made for you. I bring it because I would rather have your no given freely upon the estate of your own free residence than your yes given under any colour of a legal necessity. She was quiet. I am not asking this afternoon, he said, for either. I am asking only this afternoon that you should read the instrument and consider it, and at some hour of your own choosing tell me what you have decided about it. He set a folded paper upon the little table beside the strawberries. It was not, in fact, sealed. It was folded once, and it had upon its outer face nothing but her name in his small, orderly hand. There is, he said, a further matter. Please, Your Grace, I have written, he said, to my mother. You have. She has replied. I imagine she has. She wishes to call upon you in this parlour, on any afternoon at which you will receive her from the 11th of July onwards. She is at present in Bath. She will remain in Bath until she has heard from me that you will receive her. Your Grace, please write to her tomorrow that Miss Aylmer will receive her at 4 o'clock upon the 12th of July. I shall. Thank you. Winifred? Yes, Your Grace. He did not, at that moment, ask her the question. He did not, in fact, ask her anything at all. He did the smallest possible thing. He crossed one further step of the 4 feet that had lain between them since April, and he offered her his hand, and she gave him hers, and the two of them stood in her mother's parlour at Aylmer Hall in Hampshire at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 28th of June in the year of our Lord 1814. For the length of exactly one breath, and then he raised the back of her hand to his mouth in the small, correct gesture of a caller whose call has arrived at its ordinary, decent conclusion, and he let her hand go, and he inclined his head, and he said, I shall come again on the 6th of July. On the 6th of July, Your Grace, I shall be here. He went out. The door of the parlour closed behind him with the particular precision of a door which is being closed by a housekeeper who has been listening at a discreet distance to the small silences of a decent conversation, and who knows the moment at which the conversation has ended better than either of the persons who conducted it. Winifred stood at the bow window with the 3 faintly green panes, and she watched the Duke of Halstead ride out of the great gate of Aylmer Hall on the bay horse, and the greyhound came and put its head against her slipper, and Aunt Persephone opened the door of the parlour without knocking, in her one small liberty of an aunt at 4 o'clock on a summer afternoon, and looked at the folded paper on the little table beside the strawberries, and looked at Winifred, and said nothing at all for the space of 5 seconds. Well, Aunt Persephone said, I shall have the second best tea service polished. Aunt Persephone, Winifred said, the second best tea service is the tea service we use for family. Yes, my love, I know. Winifred sat down. She did not at that moment open the folded paper. She sat with her hand upon the back of the greyhound, and she looked at the walled kitchen garden through the 3 faintly green panes of the bow window, and she thought about a March morning in Grosvenor Square, and a card upon a salver, and a boy of 14 with a cup of chocolate. She thought about the 6 minutes between Grosvenor Square and Berkeley Square that she had taken 8 minutes to walk. She thought about the second turn of a country dance in a Wiltshire ballroom. She thought about the pear blossom that had fallen without being admired by Lady Serena Price, and the north drain, and the roof of the cottage at Broken Barrow, and the letter of 2 sentences she had written on the 1st of June. She opened the folded paper. She read it. She read it once. She read it twice. It was, in the strict legal sense, exactly what he had said it was. It extinguished the 7th clause of the settlement. It left her at liberty. It made no provision, either way, for any future step. It had upon its foot, in his small, orderly hand, only her name and his signature, and the date, which was the 23rd of June, 5 days before the call. He had signed it then on the 23rd of June, 2 days after the ball, before he had come to Aylmer Hall, before he had asked her, in the parlour of the bow window with the 3 faintly green panes, to consider it. She folded the paper. She put it in the drawer of the escritoire beside the letter about the debt. She locked the drawer. She put the key back on the ribbon around her neck. "Aunt Persephone," she said. "Yes, my love. On the 12th of July, I think, we shall have the best tea service. The best, my love, yes, I had thought so." The best tea service came out upon the 12th of July. The Duchess of Halstead, mother of the current Duke, was a woman of 56, of a small, precise figure and a very great deal of undisplayed opinion, and she arrived at Aylmer Hall at 10 minutes past 4 in a travelling coach with 2 footmen and a maid, and she was shown into the small parlour with the bow window and the 3 faintly green panes and the bowl of hothouse strawberries and the greyhound of the copper collar. She took a cup of tea. She spoke of the roads for 4 minutes, and of her son's late father for 3, and then she set her teacup upon the little table with the small, deliberate movement of a woman who had accomplished the preliminaries. "Miss Aylmer," she said, "I am aware that I have not until this afternoon had the pleasure of your acquaintance." "Your Grace, I have, however, had for the past 7 years the education of a son who has, in that period, not spoken more words about any young lady of my acquaintance than would fill the back of a small envelope. He wrote to me upon the 22nd of June a letter of a length I had not, in 7 years, received from him. It contained your name in the 3rd paragraph and in each of the 7 subsequent paragraphs. It informed me of a country dance, and of a library at the top of a south stair, and of a debt, and of a north drain, and of a folder of papers, and of a small parlour with 3 faintly green panes of glass, and of the hour at which he intended to call again." She paused. She looked at the greyhound. The greyhound looked back at her with the polite indifference of a small dog who had decided, some minutes previously, that the Duchess of Halstead was a woman she was not required to court. "I have come this afternoon," the Duchess said, "not to give you my consent, which I have no right to withhold, and which you have no need to seek, and not to give you my opinion, which is that you are precisely the woman I would have chosen for my son, had I been permitted to make the choice on his behalf, and which he would rightly have resented had I made it. I have come this afternoon only to inform you that if my son, at any hour in the next 4 years or in the next 40, should have the sense to ask you the question, I take it he has not, in his particular way, yet asked, and if you should have the sense to give him the answer, I take it you have not, in your particular way, yet given, I should consider myself very much in your debt. I do not, Miss Aylmer, use the word debt lightly. I am aware in this respect that it is a word my son has come, in the last 6 weeks, to prefer above almost all others." Winifred did not, at that moment, know what to say. It was a rare condition for her. She said, at last, the only thing that seemed to her true. "Your Grace," she said, "your son and I are at present meeting one another rather more slowly than the general run of things. I do not, however, believe that either of us has, in his or her own private accounting, mistaken the direction of the meeting. The Duchess of Halstead did something with her mouth that was, perhaps, the beginning of a smile, and permitted it this time to complete itself. It was a smile that would have made the Duke of Halstead, had he been in the room, immediately certain that his mother had, in the space of 11 minutes, formed exactly the opinion of Miss Aylmer that she had come to Aylmer Hall to form. "Miss Aylmer," she said, "you will do." "Your Grace," Winifred said, "I sincerely hope so." They took a second cup of tea. They spoke at some length of the pear tree in the walled kitchen garden, which was, at the 12th of July, in the small, green, undecided beginning of the year's fruit. They spoke of the roof of the cottage at Broken Barrow. They spoke of Aunt Persephone's father, who had been a friend of the Duchess's uncle at Oxford. At 5:30, the Duchess of Halstead rose and put on her gloves and went to her travelling coach, and Winifred and Aunt Persephone stood at the front steps of Aylmer Hall and watched the coach go down the Serpentine Drive, and Mrs. Emberley came out with the greyhound, and the greyhound put its nose against Winifred's slipper with the air of a small dog who understood that the day's business had at last been concluded to everyone's satisfaction. There was a further caller that summer that Winifred had not expected. He came upon a Wednesday in the last week of July in a chaise from the town of Barrow St. Mary without announcement, and he presented at the door a card which said, in the plain print of a stationer of Lincoln's Inn, Mr. Ambrose Fane, solicitor at law, Mrs. Emberley showed him into the small parlour with an eyebrow that had been raised to the exact angle of 5¼ degrees, and Winifred, who had been reading a letter from her cousin Julian at the little table with the strawberries and the small blue and white teapot, rose and received him. "Miss Aylmer," Mr. Fane said. He was a man of perhaps 50, of a spare grey figure, with a manner that combined the small, precise habits of a Lincoln's Inn solicitor with the small, precise habits of a man who had, in a long private career, learned to distinguish the persons whose business required his caution from the persons whose business required only his patience. "Mr. Fane, you are one of His Grace's advisers, I think." "I am one of His Grace's advisers, Miss Aylmer, and I am also, if you will permit me, the executor of your late uncle's will. I have come, at His Grace's request, upon a matter that concerns you rather more than it concerns him." "Please, Mr. Fane, do sit down." He sat. He set upon the little table a folder of papers rather thicker than the folder of papers His Grace had brought upon the 28th of June. He looked at her,